I'm Rachel Monroe, 29 years old, and 2 months ago, I watched my father burn a $38 million check in front of our entire family. He stood in my grandfather's study, gripping it with shaking hands, and lit the edge with his gold lighter, the one Grandpa gave him on his 40th birthday. As the flames curled the paper, my father smiled like he'd won, but I just stood there, calm, steady, watching the ashes fall into the wastebasket. Not a word left my mouth. Not a flicker of panic touched my face before I get into the rest of it. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had someone try to erase what you've earned just because they never had it themselves, hit that subscribe button. I grew up in Westfield, Ohio, in a house that always smelled like lavender polish and old paper. My grandfather, Walter Monroe, built Monroe Industries from the ground up, starting with a borrowed pickup and a few handshakes. By the time I was born, he owned half the real estate between our town and Lake Erie. But with me, he wasn't a businessman. He was Grandpa, the man who took me to the botanical gardens every Sunday and made sure I never missed an ice cream after church. He'd sit beside me on a green iron bench and ask what I'd been thinking about that week, like my thoughts mattered more than the headlines. He was in his hands weren't soft. He'd built things once before, the suits and meetings, but his voice was gentle, always, even when he corrected me. He'd say things like, "Remember, Rachel, money's a tool, not a trophy, and if you build something, make sure it's worth more than just profit." My father, David Monroe, was a different story. He'd grown up in Grandpa's shadow, had every advantage, every private school and summer internship, but somehow none of it stuck. He'd start a project, talk a big game, get funding, and then let it fall apart. Every time Grandpa bailed him out with silence, not praise. The gap between them widened. When I was 12, I hid on the staircase and listened to one of their worst fights. My father shouting through slurred words, accusing Grandpa of favoring me, of handing me everything before I even asked. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. But that was the moment I knew I was never just his daughter. I was his rival. My mom, Elaine, did what she could. She came from a quieter world, used to art galleries and quiet dinners. She married into the Monroes with love, but not a clue of the storms ahead. She was the peacekeeper, the one who whispered excuses after missed birthdays and empty seats at recitals. "He loves you, Rachel," she'd say. "He just doesn't know how to show it." But even she couldn't stop the undercurrents. Dad drank more each year. The arguments got sharper, and by high school, Mom started sending me to Grandpa's lake house. On the bad weekends there, the air always smelled like pine, and the quiet felt like relief. We'd make grilled cheese, and he'd ask what I wanted to do with my life. Not what I should do, but what I wanted when I told him I was considering business school. He nodded once and said, "Just make sure you learn more than how to profit." When I graduated, I shocked them all by turning down an offer at Monroe Industries and starting from the bottom at a rival firm in Columbus. My brother Brian didn't understand any of it. 2 years younger and already calling in favors through Dad's contacts, he thought my choices were dramatic, or worse, naive. "You're making life harder than it needs to be," he told me once. I just told him I wanted to know every rung on the ladder so no one could say I hadn't earned the view from the top. The cracks widened 3 months before Grandpa got sick. Brian was caught charging personal expenses to his division's account. Dad tried to bury it, but when I wouldn't lie during the audit, Brian called me a traitor. Said, "I cared more about being right than being loyal. Family protects family," he hissed in the hospital parking lot. I just told him not when it meant destroying what Grandpa had built. I never asked to be the favorite, never wanted a pedestal. I just wanted to be seen for who I was, not who I wasn't. And as I stood outside St. Mary's Hospital that gray October morning, clutching the phone call from Mom saying, "You need to come now," I had no idea just how far that loyalty would be tested. The first morning I walked into St. Mary's, the halls felt too quiet. It was early, just past 7, and the nurses were changing shifts. Grandpa was asleep, his skin pale against the white hospital sheets. But when I said his name, he opened his eyes and gave me a tired smile. I pulled a chair to his bedside and stayed until visiting hours ended. Then I came back the next day, and the day after that. I'd head in before work, come back after, and sit with him until the nurses asked me to leave. Mom brought crossword books and a thermos of tea. Dad stopped by more often now, usually in a rush. He'd talk with the nurses longer than with Grandpa. My Uncle Tom came too loud and too cheerful, leaving brochures on trusts and estates on the windowsill like they were gifts. Some nights Grandpa would whisper, "The vultures are circling," then nod toward the door after they'd left. I'd adjust his pillow and tell him not to say things like that. But his eyes never lost their clarity. He'd built too much, seen too much to pretend he didn't know what was coming. The second week, I found Dad in the hallway holding a thick folder. He said it was company paperwork that needed Grandpa's signature. I didn't ask what it was, but Grandpa waited until we were alone to say David's grasping. That folder isn't about business. It's about control. He was quiet for a while after that until the oxygen machine clicked on. Then he turned and said, "Rachel, I've made 2 plans. One of them, David will fight. Let him think he's won." I asked him what he meant, but he just pressed my hand and said, "You'll understand. Just trust the process, especially when it feels like everything's falling apart." I said I would. I meant it. It was a hard night after that. His oxygen levels dropped, and the nurse had to call in the attending. I stayed until they stabilized him, then sat beside him while he drifted in and out. At one point he looked at me and said, "You always asked questions, even when you were little. That's what I liked. You didn't take things at face value." By the 3rd week, the visitors started showing up more often. Cousins I hadn't seen in 10 years. A niece of his from Florida who'd once accused him of cheating her brother in a land deal. They brought flowers and awkward jokes and left behind the faint scent of ambition. Dad brought papers every few days. He said they were routine, but I noticed how quickly he shuffled them away when I entered the room. Uncle Tom became chatty with the staff. Marilyn stopped by with a catered lunch and handed out business cards for her new financial firm. Brian showed up once and spent the entire visit scrolling through his phone. That night, Grandpa asked to speak with his lawyer. Paul Sanders arrived early the next morning, briefcase in hand. The meeting lasted almost 2 hours. When I came back in, Grandpa looked calm, peaceful even. "It's settled," he said. "Now we can enjoy whatever time's left." So we did. I brought in old photo albums and we went through pictures of family trips and company milestones. Sometimes he'd fall asleep in the middle of a story, but he always smiled when he woke and saw I was still there. The night before he passed, the room felt still in a different way. There was a hush, like even the machines knew something was ending. I was dabbing his forehead with a damp cloth when he said, "Remember when you were 10 and fell off the dock at the lake house?" I nodded. "You didn't cry, just got up, let your grandmother wrap your knee, and went back out an hour later." I said I wanted to prove I wasn't scared. "No," he replied, "you wanted to prove to yourself that falling didn't define you." He looked out the window where the sky was starting to lighten. "Use that in the days ahead." Those were the last words he spoke to me. He passed quietly the next morning just as the sun broke over the hills. I stayed with him until the nurse came in. Then I walked out to my car and sat there with the engine off, hands on the wheel, trying to feel something I could name. The funeral was exactly what I expected. My father stood front and center, the grieving son. Brian shook hands and thanked people like he was hosting a fundraiser. Aunt Marilyn dabbed her eyes behind designer sunglasses and whispered complaints about the catering. I stood apart from them. I didn't want comfort. I didn't want polite nods or condolences from people who hadn't visited him in years. Paul Sanders stood at the back of the chapel, hands folded, eyes red. When we spoke briefly at the reception, he said, "Your grandfather was a rare man. They don't make them like him anymore." I nodded. Words felt too small. In the days that followed, the will reading loomed like a thundercloud. Dad paced more made phone calls behind closed doors and started using the phrase, "after everything's finalized." At dinner 3 nights before, he told Brian the company's assets would need to be streamlined quickly. Mom caught my eye from across the table but said nothing. Later that night, as I packed a bag to spend the weekend at my apartment, she came into my room and sat on the edge of the bed. "Whatever happens Friday," she said, "just remember, money changes people. Sometimes it shows you who they've been all along." I thought she meant Dad, maybe Brian. But something in her voice made me pause. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat out on my tiny balcony with a blanket wrapped around my legs, looking up at the sky. I thought about Grandpa's voice, his stories, his warnings. I whispered to the dark, It wasn't about the money. I wasn't sure if I believed it yet, but saying it gave me a little peace. The morning of the will reading the house felt different, quieter, the kind of quiet that comes before something breaks. 14 of us crammed into Grandpa's study, the same room where he'd built the company where he used to let me play with the globe on his desk, where he signed the deal that turned a small-town business into a national name. Dad sat in Grandpa's chair, hands folded like a CEO waiting for a vote. Paul asked him politely to move. "I'll need the desk clear," he said. Dad stood slowly and backed away without a word. I sat near the window, letting the sunlight warm my back. Paul cleared his throat and said, "Before we begin, I want to note that Walter Monroe was of sound mind when these documents were signed. They are legal binding and not subject to contest." Dad's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Paul began with small things: gifts to the staff, a donation to Grandpa's college, his art collection to Mom. Brian would get the vintage cars and a trust to be released in a few years. Then Paul paused, took a sip of water, and said, "As for Monroe Industries and the primary estate holdings—" I heard the breath catch in someone's throat. Paul continued, "To my granddaughter Rachel Monroe, I leave 49% of Monroe Industries as well as personal assets totaling $38 million with the condition that she maintain responsible financial stewardship for 1 year." The silence felt thick, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then the chair scraped against the wood as Dad stood. "This is a joke," he said. "It's a setup." Paul held up a hand. "There's more. A message. From Walter himself." Dad was already walking toward the desk, toward the oversized check Paul had brought as a symbolic gesture. He picked it up, held it in both hands, then reached into his pocket. And just like that, he lit the corner. The flames spread quickly, the paper curled in on itself, and when it fell into the wastebasket, he said, "This is what I think of this farce." Everyone stared at him, everyone except me, because I already knew. There was a second plan. When the check burned, no one moved. The only sound in the room was the whisper of paper turning to ash. I didn't say a word. I just watched my father's face tight with satisfaction, flushed with heat. He dropped what was left of the check into the wastebasket like it was trash and turned back to face the room. Alex looked stunned. Aunt Marilyn covered her mouth. Paul Sanders stayed perfectly still, hands folded over the will documents. I stayed by the window, letting the silence settle. Paul cleared his throat. "As I mentioned, there's a video message Mr. Monroe requested we play after the reading." Dad's voice cut through. "What video?" Paul reached for his briefcase. It was recorded a few weeks before his passing. He requested it be shown after the reading of the will, with everyone present. Dad looked ready to argue, but something in Paul's tone stopped him. He stepped back, arms crossed, jaw set tight. Paul pulled out a small laptop and connected it to the projector already set up in the study. The screen glowed against the wall, casting a faint light across the stunned faces in the room. Grandpa appeared on screen, sitting upright in his hospital bed, a plaid blanket tucked around his lap. His voice was steady, even warm. "If you're seeing this," he said, "then it means everything's been set in motion." He talked about legacy, about the difference between building and maintaining. He spoke plainly about the company, the family, and his decision to entrust the majority of his estate to someone who had, in his words, earned it quietly by doing the hard things when no one was watching. Dad didn't sit. He didn't speak, just stood there staring at the screen like he could will it to go dark. When the video ended, Paul closed the laptop without a word. No one said anything, not for a long while. Then Dad turned and walked out of the room. Alex followed, glancing at me once before disappearing down the hall. Mom stood slowly, came over to me, and gave my hand a quiet squeeze. Aunt Martha asked for someone to help her to the car. By the time the room emptied, it was just Paul and me left. He walked over and shut the door gently behind the last cousin, then turned to me with a small nod. "They don't understand why you didn't react," he said. "I was told to trust the process," I answered. He looked at me a moment longer, then opened his briefcase again. "This is for you," he said, handing me a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter in Grandpa's handwriting. There were documents too: trusts, ownership confirmations, banking transfers, all dated weeks before he passed. Paul explained. "The funds were moved early. The shares were already restructured. The check your father burned was symbolic, nothing more." I sat down in the chair beside Grandpa's desk and read the letter twice. Paul gave me space. When I finally looked up, he said, "Your grandfather didn't like leaving things to chance." I nodded, folding the papers carefully. He added, "We'll still need to release the official estate notice next week, but nothing your father tries can undo what's already been finalized." Later that night, we watched a second video, one recorded only for me. Grandpa spoke slower in this one, his words a little softer. "If your father reacted the way I feared he said, then you now know why I had to do things this way. I hoped I was wrong. I wanted to believe he'd grown, but I couldn't risk everything on that hope." He told me the details of the transfers, which accounts were now under my control, how the trustees were selected, what he hoped I'd do next. "You don't owe anyone a performance," he said near the end. "You just owe the people who rely on this company your honesty, your effort, and your integrity. That's all." He smiled then, the same quiet smile he used to give me when I solved a riddle or beat him at cards. When the screen went dark, I sat still for a long time. Paul closed the laptop gently and asked if I wanted to wait before playing the family version. "No," I said. "Let them hear it. It's time." The next day, word started spreading. At first there were whispers, disbelief. A few relatives called to ask if it was true. Brian sent a short text, 3 words. "Did you know I didn't answer?" By the end of the week, Dad had stopped acknowledging me in the hallway. He still lived at the family house, and so did I for now. But we moved around each other like strangers. Brian alternated between snide remarks and silent dinners. Once as I passed him in the foyer, he muttered, "Hope it was worth it." Mom kept up appearances, asked about my day, offered coffee in the morning, but the tension around her eyes said she knew the storm wasn't over. At lunch that Wednesday, she looked across the table at me and said, "He's meeting with lawyers. 3 firms already." I stirred my tea. "Does he really think he can overturn it?" "He thinks he has to try," she said quietly. "But it won't go anywhere. Your grandfather was careful." She glanced toward the window. "What I want," she added, "is for this family to stop pretending things were fine before. They weren't. And maybe now we'll finally face that." Her words stayed with me. So did the look she gave me, part warning, part permission. What she didn't know was that while Dad was preparing legal briefs, I was meeting with Karen Bell, the financial advisor Grandpa had selected. I was also meeting the trustees, the legal team, and the interim audit committee Grandpa had quietly formed months ago. One of the trustees, a woman named Carol Denton, told me during our second meeting, "Your grandfather flagged several concerns before he got sick, especially regarding the Westridge acquisition." Karen nodded beside her. "It put the company in serious debt. The numbers in the report were optimistic, or fabricated," I said. Karen smiled faintly. "We prefer aggressively speculative. But yes, you'll want independent review." That Friday morning, an audit team arrived at Monroe Industries, quiet, professional, and carrying clipboards. By noon, word had spread across the office. By 2, I had a voicemail from Grandpa's former executive assistant, Janet Spencer. "Rachel," she said, "your father is not taking this well. He stormed out of a meeting. I think he knows this goes deeper than he let on." I thanked her and hung up. The next day, Brian texted again. Just one line. "What are you doing?" I didn't respond. That Sunday, we all sat around the dinner table pretending things were normal. Dad arrived late. His tie was crooked. His eyes looked tired. He poured a drink, said nothing. Brian kept looking down at his phone. Mom passed the bread basket without comment. It wasn't until halfway through the meal that Dad set his fork down a little too hard and said, "So, I suppose you've heard about the audit." I looked up, met his eyes. "I've heard rumors." He laughed, a bitter sound. "Rumors," he repeated. "That's what we're calling it." No one spoke. 5,000 employees, he said. Years of work. And now the trustees think they can tear it all down. I didn't raise my voice. "Did you build it?" I asked. Or did Grandpa Dad stare at me? "You don't know what it takes," he said. "You've never carried that kind of weight. Never made a call at 3 a.m. Never faced investors breathing down your neck." I set down my napkin. "No," I said. "But I've never lied on a report either." He went still. Brian's head snapped up. "What do you know about the report?" I didn't answer. Dad pointed a finger at me. "This is your doing. You planted this. You're trying to ruin everything. Mom stepped in, then her voice low but firm. David, stop. He ignored her. You've been playing him for years, he said. All those lunches, all those visits. You were planning this from the start. I didn't move. I loved him, I said. He said nothing. Brian looked from him to me, then pushed his chair back and left the room. Mom sat down slowly, folded her hands in her lap. He's afraid, she said after a while. He's afraid he's about to lose everything. Not the company, not the money, the story he's told himself about who he is. The table was quiet again. I didn't say anything else, because I knew what was coming next, and I knew it wasn't fear he was about to face. It was truth. 2 days after that dinner, I received an early call from Karen Bell. The audit findings were nearly complete. Her voice was calm, but the numbers weren't. The Westridge acquisition had been worse than expected. Overstated revenue projections, vague licensing agreements, and debt levels that no one on the board had previously approved in full. That afternoon, I met with the trustees. We sat in the small conference room off the estate office, the same room where Grandpa used to hold quarterly reviews with his senior staff. I brought a yellow legal pad and left with a list of 21 concerns. 12 of them would require immediate attention. That evening, I stayed up past midnight, going through old meeting minutes and balance sheets Karen had flagged. I didn't know everything yet, but I knew enough. What Dad had done wasn't just reckless, it had consequences. The next morning, a formal notice went out to the board and key shareholders. The audit report would be presented the following week in a closed session. I received confirmation within hours that all trustees would attend. Dad's assistant also RSVP'd on his behalf. The Sunday family dinner that followed was different from the last. Dad didn't speak during most of the meal. Brian picked at his food. Mom kept the conversation on neutral ground weather flowers starting to bloom, whether she should repaint the upstairs hallway. Then just as I was getting up to clear my plate, Dad spoke. "I want a meeting," he said. "Tuesday morning. Just us." I nodded. 10 o'clock in my office. It was the first time he'd said those words, my office, since the will reading. Tuesday came, and I arrived 5 minutes early. His office at Monroe Industries still bore his name on the door, though the paint was starting to chip. Inside, the lights were dim. A thick folder sat closed on the desk. Dad stood when I entered, motioned for me to sit, then closed the door behind me. "You've made things difficult," he said, "but not impossible." I waited. "We can still fix this," he continued. "Salvage the Westridge deal, manage the optics. I've got a plan, but I'll need access to the capital your grandfather left you." I didn't speak. He walked around to his side of the desk, rested his hands on the edge, and looked at me. "You're in the position now, whether I like it or not. But you don't know what it's like to run something this size. You haven't had to stand in front of a room full of investors and defend projections that are falling apart." I folded my hands in my lap. "So here's my proposal," he said. "You authorize a transfer of $8 million to cover the Westridge shortfall. In exchange, I'll agree to bring in an interim consultant to review the remaining finances. Quietly. We keep this internal. No outside press, no shareholder panic, and you stay as CEO," I asked. His jaw clenched slightly. "That's the best way forward." I looked across the room to the framed photo of him and Grandpa from a ribbon-cutting ceremony 10 years ago. Then I looked back at him. "No," I said. "That's not the way forward." He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "You don't have to do it for me. Do it for the company." I stood. "I am." The board meeting was held 2 days later. Every member was present. Paul Sanders was there along with Karen and the lead trustee. Dad sat at the head of the table, but this time it was clear he didn't command the room. Karen led the audit presentation. Slide after slide, she walked through the discrepancies, beginning with the Westridge numbers, then expanding to other irregularities in the last 5 years. Deferred maintenance costs disguised as capital investments, vendor contracts awarded without proper review, bonuses issued outside of board approval. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then Howard Lane, one of the longest-serving board members, spoke. These projections, he said, tapping the printed report, are not just optimistic, they're deceptive. Who signed off on these figures? Dad looked at the report but said nothing. Another member asked whether regulatory review had already been initiated. Paul responded, "Not yet. But if action isn't taken internally, external agencies will be alerted within the next quarter." The meeting ended with a call for restructuring proposals. I requested time to present a full plan by the following week. As the board members filed out, Brian caught up to me in the hallway. "That was brutal," he said. "I didn't know it was that bad." I stopped walking and looked at him. "You sure?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "I knew some of it. Dad always said it would balance out eventually, that the market would correct, and now I think we're in trouble." I nodded. "You think they'll remove him?" he asked. "I think we don't have a choice." That weekend I didn't see Dad once. He didn't come to dinner. He didn't return calls. On Monday morning, I received a short email from his assistant confirming he would attend the restructuring session. No additional notes. I spent the next 3 days preparing. Every number, every condition. I met again with Karen, then with Carol and the other trustees. The proposal had to be exact. On Thursday, I walked into the boardroom carrying a binder and a copy of Grandpa's last letter. I didn't start with blame, I started with facts. "I'm willing to invest personal funds to stabilize the company," I said, "but that investment is conditional." I listed them clearly. I would increase my ownership stake to 65%. An interim CEO would be brought in with no ties to our family. A new CFO would be appointed within 60 days. All financial decisions over $100,000 would require trustee oversight for the next year. I finished by sliding a signed letter of intent across the table. Then I sat back and waited. Dad's voice broke the silence. "You're stripping me of everything." I met his eyes. "I'm preserving what's left." Howard nodded slowly. "I support this plan." Others followed, one after another. Only Dad voted no. He stood up, pushed his chair back and left the room. Brian remained seated. After the door shut, he leaned toward me. "He won't forgive you." "I know, but he should." I didn't reply. I gathered my papers and stepped outside where the spring air smelled like rain. It was done. Now came the part Grandpa had prepared me for. Not the fight, but the follow-through. The next few weeks moved quickly. Meetings stacked on my calendar, sometimes 2 or 3 a day. I worked closely with Karen Bell and the trustees to begin executing the restructuring plan. Margaret Chen, one of our top candidates for interim CEO, had already agreed to come aboard. She'd managed several complex transitions in the past and was known for quiet, decisive leadership. The board approved her appointment without hesitation. We met the following Tuesday in the same office where Grandpa used to hold staff briefings. Margaret was precise, well-prepared, and asked thoughtful questions. I gave her everything she needed: copies of audit documents, contact lists, summaries of pending litigation. Within a week, she'd assembled a team to begin untangling the Westridge acquisition. Her updates came daily, short and direct. My father, meanwhile, disappeared from view. He left the family home and moved out to the lake house. Mom said he needed space. I didn't argue. The board had accepted his transition to an advisory-only role, but he hadn't attended a meeting since. Brian checked in by text a few times. "Just updates, nothing personal." 6 weeks into the transition, the phone on my desk rang one morning before I'd even opened my laptop. It was Angela, the receptionist. "Rachel, your father's here," she said softly. I paused. "Did he say what he wants?" "No, just that he'd like 5 minutes. I told her to send him in. He looked different, thinner, suit a little looser. His tie knotted unevenly, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been in a long time. He stepped into my office, Grandpa's old space, and stood just inside the door. "You've made some changes," he said, glancing at the art on the wall, the smaller desk, the softer lighting. "A few," I replied. He nodded once and sat down in the visitor's chair. "I've been seeing someone," he said after a moment. "A therapist. Your mother's idea." I waited. She said I should try to understand how I got here, not just the audit or the company, but all of it. I stayed quiet. "I was angry at your grandfather for a long time," he continued, "even before you were born. I wanted his approval, but I didn't want to be like him. I thought I could outgrow his shadow, but I wasn't building anything, just reacting." He looked down at his hands, fingers tapping his knee. "I've been sober for 62 days. "That's good," I said. "I'm glad. I'm not asking for a title," he said quickly. "I don't want my role back, but I'd like to help where I can. Quietly. If you're willing." He leaned forward slightly. "The Jensen account is at risk. They've been with us a long time. I know the team there. I can speak to them, help keep them in. I considered it. I'll check with Margaret," I said. "If she's comfortable, we can arrange something. Consultant status, project specific." He nodded. "That's more than fair." He stood, then paused at the door. "Your grandfather would be proud, Rachel, not just of what you've done, but how you've done it." After he left, I didn't move for a while. I just sat there with my hands folded on the desk, the morning sun warming the side of my face. A week later, the Wall Street Journal ran a feature on the transition. Monroe Industries enters a new chapter. The article was balanced, factual, even respectful. The reporter quoted 2 industry analysts who praised the transparency of the restructuring. Karen forwarded it to me with a simple message, worth framing. The coverage brought attention. Business schools requested case materials. Colleagues from my old firm reached out. A few board members suggested I consider stepping into a more formal role, executive chair, or even CEO after Margaret's term. I didn't give an answer right away. That same month, I invited Mom to lunch. We went to her favorite place downtown, the little bistro she used to visit with Grandpa on gallery days. She looked more relaxed than I'd seen her in years, lighter, as if she'd set something down that had been too heavy for too long. "The separation is helping," she said. "He's doing the work, for real this time." I nodded. "And I'm rediscovering parts of myself I forgot about. I've started helping at the museum again, just part-time, but it feels good." I smiled. "I'm sorry if I made things harder," I said quietly. "I know the transition wasn't easy." "Rachel," she said, reaching across the table, "you did what needed to be done. Your father and I were headed for something like this anyway. You just gave it a name." "And Brian?" I asked. She smiled. "He's surprising me. He's focused. The way you structured that trust, it gave him a reason to start fresh. He's working with a vintage restoration shop. Late nights, calloused hands. It's the most I've seen him engaged in years." Later that evening, I sat by the window in my apartment watching the lights flicker across the city skyline. The company was stabilizing. The board was stronger. The foundation Grandpa wanted to start was nearly ready to launch. I thought of that day in the study, when the check burned, when everyone looked at me like I should fall apart, and I thought of what Grandpa had said near the end. It's not about what they do, it's about how you respond. The following week, I sent a short message to Margaret, just a thank you and a note about how grateful I was for her steady hand during the transition. She replied that evening with her signature one-liner. "We're not done yet, but we're definitely on course." She was right. The road ahead wasn't smooth. There were more decisions, more changes, more conversations that would test our patience and our pride. But something had shifted. The fight was over. Now came the rebuilding. The 6th month came quietly. Monroe Industries was showing signs of steady recovery. Margaret's leadership had done exactly what we hoped: calm the board, reestablish confidence, and start reshaping our internal processes without disruption. We lost 2 smaller clients during the audit fallout, but the larger accounts held firm. Some, like Jensen, even expanded. I spent most of my time in transition meetings reviewing department reports and attending weekly check-ins with Karen and the trustees. I'd taken on more of a visible role, still not CEO, but present. The staff began to recognize me not just as Walter Monroe's granddaughter, but as someone actively involved. Our internal communications team launched the Rebuild Initiative, a transparency campaign designed to restore employee trust. The response was better than I expected. Department heads reported more feedback, more questions, and maybe most importantly, more hope. One morning in late August, I arrived early to finalize a quarterly review. The building was still waking up. Margaret was already in her office reviewing a legal document. "We're ready," she said, glancing up. "You'll lead the meeting." I hesitated for a second. She nodded again. It's time. The meeting went well. I presented a revised growth forecast, Karen walked through new compliance safeguards, and Margaret shared updates on open negotiations. Afterward, Margaret and I stepped outside for coffee. We stood by the planter boxes near the plaza entrance where Grandpa had once insisted on adding native wildflowers, something honest he used to say. "You've found your footing," she said. "I've had help." She looked at me thoughtfully. "When I finish my term in a few months, the board will ask you to stay in this seat. You should be ready to say yes." I didn't answer then. I just looked out at the rows of people coming and going, the city already warming up beneath the morning sun. Later that week, I visited the foundation office we'd set up down the block. The Maxwell Monroe Foundation was small, but active 3 full-time staff and a part-time outreach coordinator. We'd just finalized our first scholarship program for students in manufacturing and engineering, something Grandpa had talked about for years. I stood in the doorway of the office kitchen, watching the staff prep packets for an upcoming high school event. One of them, Leah, held up a flyer. "We're including his quote at the bottom. Build more than you take. That okay?" I nodded. "It's perfect." That same afternoon, I received a text from Brian. "Dinner this week, just us." We met 2 days later at a quiet diner halfway between his apartment and mine. He looked good, healthier, sun on his skin, a little paint beneath one fingernail. "The shop's busier than I expected," he said, setting his phone aside. "We just finished a 1968 Mustang rebuild, full restoration." "That's great." He leaned forward slightly. "You know, for a long time I thought Grandpa passed me over because I wasn't polished enough. Not serious. But I think now, maybe he knew I needed space to figure it out for myself." I stirred my coffee. "He gave you space too," Brian added, "but in a different way. He knew what you were capable of. He knew a lot of things I said." Brian smiled. "You're not just holding it together, Rachel. You're moving it forward." On the walk back to my car, I thought about how far we'd come and how far we still had to go. That weekend, Mom hosted a small dinner at home, just the 3 of us. She'd made Grandpa's favorite chicken recipe. The air in the kitchen smelled like rosemary and lemon. Brian brought a bottle of wine and we ate on the back patio. Mom asked about the foundation. Brian talked about the restoration schedule. The conversation moved gently without tension. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Mom looked toward me. "Have you thought about the anniversary?" I nodded. "The gardens." Grandpa had funded the entire west side expansion of the city's botanical gardens nearly 15 years earlier. "That's where I plan to hold the private memorial." "We'll keep it small," I said. "Just family and the board." She nodded. "He'd like that." The next morning, I met with Paul Sanders. We reviewed the terms of the 1-year management agreement Grandpa had written into the will. The anniversary was approaching, and with it full control of all estate assets. "Everything's in place," Paul said. "You've met every requirement. The trust transitions formally at midnight on the anniversary." I signed the confirmation paperwork and tucked the documents into my briefcase. Paul looked across the desk, steady and kind. "You've done right by him." That night, I poured a glass of Grandpa's favorite scotch and sat quietly by the window. The city outside was still. Just the low hum of traffic, the occasional siren, the soft click of an elevator bell down the hall. I thought about what we'd all lost and what we'd found in the space left behind, not just control of a company, but something harder to name, something earned, not given. The next morning, I sent Margaret an email. I was ready to discuss the board's offer. The morning of the memorial was quiet. I woke early, made coffee, and ironed the navy dress Grandpa had once said made me look ready for anything. I arrived at the gardens before anyone else. The staff was still arranging chairs near the rose beds, the same ones he'd helped plant back when the west wing of the garden was just a sketch on an easel. I stood near the stone archway and watched the sun rise over the hedges, casting soft light across the grass. A few petals had fallen overnight, scattered on the brick path like they were left there on purpose. Margaret arrived first. She greeted me with a nod, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "Everything's on schedule," she said. "You'll speak after the trustee's statement." "Thank you," I replied. Slowly, the rest of the group gathered: board members, longtime employees, a few family friends. Paul Sanders stood off to the side, straightening his tie. Mom and Brian came together, both dressed simply, both quiet. Then a few minutes before the ceremony began, Dad walked in. He wore a dark suit, neatly pressed, and carried nothing in his hands. He nodded to Paul, then to Margaret. Finally, he looked at me and gave the smallest nod. I returned it. The ceremony began at exactly 10. The head of the board gave a short welcome. A trustee read a letter Grandpa had written years ago when he funded the gardens, something about growth and why beauty should be accessible to everyone, not just those who could afford it. Then it was my turn. I stepped to the podium. The wood felt warm under my fingers. Maxwell Monroe believed in building I began. Not just buildings, not just companies, but people, ideas, futures. I looked around the small crowd. My eyes paused on Margaret, then on Paul, then briefly on Dad. He used to say that success meant leaving something better than you found it, that the real test wasn't what you built, but how it lasted after you were gone. I spoke for 5 minutes, maybe 6. When I stepped down, the garden was still and quiet, filled with the soft breath of early fall air and people not quite ready to leave. After the ceremony, Dad approached slowly. He waited until the others had drifted toward the reception tables before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy," he said, about what he meant when he talked about building more than you take. I didn't interrupt. I thought he was talking about wealth, Dad continued. About business. Turns out, he was talking about people. We stood side by side near the rose bed. The breeze carried the scent of soil and petals. "I've been going through old records," he added. Letters, notes from meetings, margins of ledgers where he'd scribbled ideas. He looked at me then. "You're doing what he hoped someone would do. You're making it matter." Before I could answer, he stepped back, nodded once more, and joined Mom near the reception area. Later that evening, Brian and I had dinner together, just the two of us at a small table near the window of a corner restaurant. The lights inside were low, and the street outside was quiet. "I've got a buyer lined up for the El Camino," he said between bites. "Says he's been looking for that exact model for 3 years. You gonna sell it?" He shrugged. "Still deciding. Grandpa and I rebuilt that thing together when I was 17. Hard to part with." We sipped our drinks in silence for a while. "You know," he said, setting his glass down, "I was angry for a long time. Thought he gave you everything and left me scraps. You weren't the only one who thought that," I said. He nodded slowly. "But now I think maybe he gave each of us what we needed." I looked at him across the table. "He gave you the reins," Brian said. "He gave me time and space and a plan with just enough structure to keep me honest." We sat a moment longer. "Turns out I like building things," he added. "Real things. Hands-on. Tangible. Dad never saw it, but Grandpa did." I smiled. He always saw more than he said. Walking home that night, I passed the old Monroe building, its tall windows still lit from within. Inside, Margaret's team was wrapping up for the evening. I paused across the street, hands in my coat pockets, and looked up at the logo etched into the glass. Tomorrow would mark 1 year since the will reading, 1 year since everything changed and everything began. 1 year to the day after the will reading, I arrived early at the office. The city was just beginning to stir windows, lighting up floor-by-floor delivery trucks, pulling into alleys, crosswalk signs ticking from red to white. I took the elevator to the executive floor, stepped into the quiet, and looked out at the skyline. Everything felt different now. Margaret had officially accepted the permanent CEO position after her interim term. I'd moved into the role of executive chair guiding long-term strategy and board governance. The office culture had shifted. No more closed doors, no more whispered doubts. We'd implemented Grandpa's sustainability plan, restructured benefits, and launched a scholarship foundation in his name. The company was stable again, but more than that, it was honest. Sophia, my assistant, poked her head in. "Leadership meeting starts in 10. I nodded and gathered my notes. These quarterly meetings had become my rhythm. Department heads from across the organization, product, legal people, ops sharing updates in the same room. It kept us aligned. It kept us human. Dad sat midway down the table, not at the head, not beside me, just where he belonged now, advisory limited, but present. 9 months sober, consistent in therapy, and focused on client relationships. He no longer barked orders or closed deals in secret. When he spoke now, it was deliberate, measured, and brief. During the meeting, he reported on the Jensen expansion. No embellishment, no spin, just results and next steps. When the session ended, he approached quietly. "That went well," he said. "They've got a solid plan for Europe." I nodded. "Margaret's team has been thorough." He hesitated, then added, "I'll be at the service tomorrow if that's still okay." "It is," I said. "Mom mentioned you might come." He looked down, thumb grazing the edge of his folder. "I've been thinking about him a lot, about the parts I never understood until now. I didn't speak. I'm trying to learn those lessons. Late, maybe, but I am." He stepped back, gave a polite nod, and left. That evening, Brian and I had dinner together. He looked proud but relaxed, someone who'd finally stepped into his own skin. The restoration business was taking off. He'd earned a slot at a national auto show next spring. Grandpa would have loved that. "You know," Brian said, leaning back in his chair for a long time, "I thought the trust was a leash. Turns out it was a ladder, just slow." He told me about a letter he'd found tucked into the back of a ledger Grandpa had kept in the garage. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a few notes scribbled in pencil. "Trust isn't given it read. It's built, tested, earned, and sometimes restored." The memorial the next morning was small, just as Grandpa would have wanted. We gathered in the rose garden where he and I used to walk on Sunday afternoons. The air was crisp. The trees had just begun to turn. When I spoke, I didn't talk about titles or audits or inheritance. I talked about his belief in people, about how he saw potential even when no one else did. I said what mattered most wasn't the money or the buildings, but the values that held them together. Afterward, I slipped away from the group and walked to his headstone. It was simple. Just his name, the dates, and a phrase he once told me in passing. He built more than he took. I knelt beside it and laid fresh flowers across the base. "We're doing okay," I whispered. "The company's steady. The family's healing. Slowly." I sat there for a while, not waiting for a sign, just breathing in the quiet. That evening I poured a small glass of scotch and stood at the window just like I had after the will reading. Only this time, there was no uncertainty, no plan to decipher, no fire to put out. Just peace. Some inheritances come in the form of wealth. Others come quietly in the choices we make when no one's watching. The steady voice we find in ourselves. The dignity we carry when someone tries to take it away. Grandpa left me more than a company. He gave me the chance to become someone I might never have discovered otherwise. If you've ever had to earn back your name, if you've ever learned your strength the hard way, thank you for listening. And if this story stayed with you, feel free to share it with someone who needs a little reminder that quiet resilience may just be the greatest legacy of all.